present on a lesson that I did on closing conversations and face-to-face interactions, and this is for my Spanish class. Briefly, I will talk about my approach to teaching conversation in the language classroom, and also some of the obstacles that I faced in preparation for this lesson. Then I will go ahead and show you the model that I designed on closing up a conversation in Spanish, and this is casual or ordinary conversations. The teaching of conversation in the language classroom. So what can we teach our students? And this is for, as I mentioned, Spanish 142, which is the end of the second semester. We can teach them L2 interaction patterns. And why? Because it exposes them to real-life interaction in the target language at an early stage. But then the obstacles were what patterns to teach our students. So I read some articles, and Baraja Rohan, in her 1997 article, she proposes a list of patterns that we can teach them that have very specific social cultural norms. And these were apologizing, complimenting, accepting or declining an invitation or request, seeking acceptance after a refusal, and in my case, I will focus on closing a conversation, and this would be in face-to-face conversations in Spanish. So one of the problems that I faced while preparing for this lesson is, as teachers, we sometimes need to select topics that might be overwhelming in a multi-ethnic classroom. And we have to ask ourselves, what topics are appropriate for the whole class? Which ones are too sensitive? And will the topics be relevant to their needs? I follow Betts and Hood's model in which they talk about that the teaching and learning interaction patterns can be done at the beginner's level. They also argue that explicit instruction is necessary for students to notice the learning target. And teaching interaction involves the judicious use of learners L1, or the common language. In our case, it would be English. Okay? So why I chose closing up a conversation in Spanish, they are part of our daily activities. So when we come into contact with others, we usually open a conversation, and we must appropriately close a conversation, right? And this is because abrupt closes are generally seen as impolite. Also, closings require some sort of negotiation and understanding between those involved in the conversation. And in the teaching of these patterns in the language classroom, it allows for opportunities for in-class discussion of the L1, the L2 patterns, and the social cultural norms associated with properly closing a conversation. And finally, in the teaching as well, we can have them practice these patterns, both in writing and later on in speaking. So the pedagogical model that I am following is the one proposed by Betts and Hood, which is inspired by Baraja Rohan article and books published in 1997. So there's the first phase would be awareness raising activity, in which the students reflect on how language works, how language in action works. Then we do a constructive analysis of the L1 and the L2. Then we do an analysis of the L2 structures with authentic transcripts and audiovisual materials. And then we practice the L2 structures in writing, and finally there is a translingual transcultural reflection. This I will focus on the first part, which is awareness raising activity. Then I will talk about the constructive analysis of L1 and L2 structures, and practice L2 in writing. For this lesson, the learning outcomes were to compare and contrast ways of closing a conversation in Spanish and in the student's L1 English or other. Also identify and recognize interactional practices used by the L1 speakers of Spanish when closing a conversation. And we will focus on 3 specific ones: justification, appreciation, and arrangement. In the pre-lesson activity, page 1, so students complete this before coming to class on the day of the lesson. And this is when students think about how interaction works in their own language. Specifically, they will have to reflect on the action that allowed them to bring a conversation to an end in an appropriate and non-abrupt manner. So they have a series of questions in which they have to just check the things that apply to them. For example, what are some of the reasons for you to bring a conversation to an end? So they check the ones that they consider are based on their experience. And I also provide them with so that they can also write other actions that they do when closing a conversation. Number two, how do they close a conversation when they talk to friends, family, or acquaintances? And they also get to select. So the idea is that here I am focusing their attention on closing conversations, but casual or informal conversations with friends, family, or acquaintances. The first day of the lesson, we do phrase one in the class again, and this is a quick reflection, this time in Spanish, of what they did at home in English. And this is the students reflecting and discussing the importance of appropriately closing a conversation in Spanish.
Rápidamente, en tu opinión, ¿por qué es importante terminar una conversación de manera cortés o apropiada? ¿Es importante o no es importante?
Es importante.
Sí, ¿por qué es importante?
Porque no quiere ser descortés, porque si estás hablando con un amigo, no quieres ¿cómo se dice? Hurt their feelings.
Ofenderlos, lastimar.
En una conversación con tu profesor o donde te trabajo con tu empleado.
Sí, claro, entonces es importante para mantener las relaciones.
So here, students begin to reflect in Spanish of the things that they actually selected in English. And the first thing that comes up is, if you don't want to be rude, you must properly close the conversation. Right, so that's one of the ideas. Students were also asked to watch their first interaction with their conversation partners outside of class. And this is what they talk about with that second question.
Para mí fue un poquito incómodo para cerrar la conversación porque en conversaciones antes de esta conversación con mi compañero de conversación, no cerrar la conversación como él quiere, solo necesita say adios or something, you know?
So here students do point that in their first interaction, they do close the conversation, but that comes up in his reflection. He points out that there is a long moment of silence in which they do not know what else to talk about. So he says goodbye, and then they hit the button and stop recording. During phase two, still on page 2, phase 2, they look at example and they compare the basic structure for closings in English and in Spanish. In phase 3, we analyze the L2 structure using an authentic video, authentic conversation, and now our focus is going to be on the pre-closings. And for that, I introduce students to this idea and explain to them that these are the warrants or the announcements that we do right before the final closings when we are trying to close the conversation and we start to realize that the conversation is winding down and it is time for us to change topics, make final comments, and then go ahead and say the goodbyes. And here again, the focus is on justification, appreciation, or arrangement, and students will arrive to these 3 aspects on their own during the analysis of the conversation. Page 3 and page 4, students get a series of questions that they need to answer based on the dialogue. For example, how does Julia decide to begin closing the conversation in line 29? So they go back to line 29 and they select the most appropriate response. Then they go again to how do Lula and Raquel react to Julia's announcement, and this is they accept that announcement of closing. But then another one takes place, right? The appreciation in line 32. And then finally, there's another pre-closing announcement in lines 35 to 37. So these are the 3 aspects that we will focus for the remaining of class, and this would be about the end of day 1. A few days later, we come back and students get a new handout, and that's page 5 on your document, and students practice the L2 structures in written form, because I thought for the actual oral production it would be forcing them to establish a conversation, then close the conversation in about 3 minutes. So for this, I only show the reconstructing the dialogue that comes from a textbook. So if you look at Diálogo Uno, so students first get in groups and then read each of the dialogues and then decide which one is the one that is natural, which would be A, and which two are the ones that come from textbooks. And then they will focus on dialogue A and they will rewrite it. So the first dialogue is, do you like the class? Yes, it's very interesting. What time is it? It's 11, see you later. So that's the whole concept of the conversation. So my students do realize that this is something that is not very common. So then they are asked to reconstruct this dialogue. So we will now listen to their reconstruction.
Hola Raúl, ¿qué tal? No te veo mucho tiempo.
Estoy bien, pero estoy ocupado con mi clase.
¿Cuál clase? ¿Te gusta?
Estoy en una clase de químicas y es difícil, pero también es muy interesante.
Bueno, pues me gusta hablar contigo, pero yo también estoy en la clase de químicas y tengo que irme.
Buena suerte, amigo. Te llamo más tarde.
Perfecto, muy bien. ¿Qué cambió acá para que sea más natural?
Expanden la conversación.
Muy bien. Expanden la conversación y ¿qué más?
Incluir el primer tema.
Que el primer tema, muy bien. En el primer tema, muy bien. ¿Qué más?
Juan tenía que ir a la clase de química.
Perfecto. Y expresa lo de apreciación. Me gustó hablar contigo, por ejemplo, y también esto, ¿no? Hay más reacciones. Buena suerte, amigo. Te llamo más tarde.
Here, so the reconstruction, they included two of the three things that we learned. So they included the justification and they also included the comment of appreciation. I have to go because I have class and it was nice seeing you. So those two things. In addition, students have a conversation activity in class that goes on for about 10 minutes. They are asked to improvise a series of conversations, and after about 2 minutes, I give them a 30-second warning in which they begin to close the conversations. Then we discuss which ones they used, but it became a little not real. They were thinking that, oh, in 30 seconds we have to use one of the three that we learned today. So another activity is that at the end of the semester, students go back to their conversation partner and they record a final conversation with them. And this is the reflection from the student who said at the beginning that he had to say goodbye because there was a moment of silence and didn't know what else to do. So his reflection, and I just got that last night, he says, during our final conversation, I was able to make comments that contributed to the conversation and gain insight about actual things pertaining to others' life. This time, there was also a more appropriate end to the conversation, rather than just stopping the recording or abruptly saying goodbye. So he's referencing this early conversation. However, as I began thinking of what to say in order to begin to close the conversation, maybe something like, pues, me voy porque tengo clase, well, I have to go because I have class, or vamos al pub después, let's go to the pub later. My classmate beat me to it and said he had to go study. So to me, they've shown that they have been able to incorporate this specific announcements or proposing the word that we looked at in class. So my conclusions from here would be that yes, conversation patterns can be taught at the first year language level. We just have to be very specific on what things and how we will teach them. Using the conversation analytic approach, we can point our students to some of the things that reoccur or that are happening throughout the conversation, and then provide them with plenty of practice, both in written, writing, in the class and outside of class, and a lot of reflective tasks, which is what they do. They go back to their first conversation multiple times throughout the semester, at least 5 times throughout the semester for specific things that they have to look for. Openings, closings, commenting, etc. In this case, they went back to their first conversation and added an appropriate closing after this lesson. So this is a process that gets repeated and it goes beyond the one lesson in the class, for example. And that's my lesson.
Okay.